Stranger from the Depths, by Jerry Turner, Scholastic Paperback 1970, illustrated cover by Emmanuel Shaunat. Chapter 1, Sunken Tomb.
The huge wave had been reported traveling toward shore only a few minutes earlier. High above the rocky shoreline, Gary and Jordan Howard strained their eyes seaward for some sign of this freak of nature. It was still too early to see anything, but they wanted to be ready when it came. Jordan fussed with his portable radio, trying to get rid of the static. His younger brother, clad in wet shorts and a faded sweatshirt, nervously busied himself with the movie camera. 10 minutes earlier, both boys had been down on the shore, poking around in search of driftwood. Gary breathed hard, still winded by the long climb to the top of the cliff. "See anything yet?" Jordan shouted. His dark hair whipped around his face as a freshening gale swept in from the Atlantic. "Just big swells," Gary replied. "Maybe even some 10-footers. But not the monster," he told himself. That wouldn't hit the beach for another 10 minutes, and then, for the first time, he wondered if they were doing a foolish thing. Jordan had turned the radio to full volume. The announcer's voice rang out urgently. "The fishing boat Doralee must now be presumed lost at sea. No further word has been heard since it reported sighting the freak waves some 200 miles east of Nantucket." The boys exchanged solemn glances. Jordan helped his brother anchor the movie camera more solidly against the rising wind. It was becoming difficult to stand erect. The cold rain had halted, but the sky now boiled with thunderous clouds that raced inland furiously. "If we had any sense, we'd get back to the Bronco and head for town," Jordan yelled. "It'll be a miracle if we aren't blown right off here." He looked down at the raging ocean and shuddered. Point Key, on the Connecticut coast, had suddenly changed from a jutting peninsula to a flimsy tower of rock in a raging cauldron. He stared down to where they had left the Bronco. This morning, when they had driven out from Bellbrook to do some beach combing, the tide was running high. But soon after they heard the report of the wave, the sea churned to nightmare proportions. They thought the Bronco would be safe, parked on the high ground beyond the beach, but now. Jordan berated himself for foolishly suggesting they climb Point Key to film the oncoming tidal wave. The beach, 100 feet below, was already submerged beneath crashing surf. It threatened to engulf the narrow spine of rock which connected their dizzy perch to the mainland. Jordan tried to measure the height from the beach to the road, guessing it was perhaps 60 feet. How much force would the tidal wave expend against Point Key's doubtful protection? "Listen, Jordan. Maybe we ought to make a run for it," he heard Gary shouting. "Maybe we can get to the Bronco in time." "Forget it," Jordan shouted back. "We'd be crazy to try. We're probably safer up here anyway." He stared down the treacherous ridge that led back to the road and shook his head. If the wave reached them while they were still seeking handholds on the face of the cliff. Gary crouched behind the rocks and made sure the lens cap was in place to protect their camera. No sense in having their equipment ruined before they could film the wave. It was hard to realize that the monster had been born only 20 minutes ago. On their portable radio they had heard the Doralee frantically reporting a gigantic tower of water rising from the ocean, just a few miles off its bow. Reaching its apex, the column had collapsed, and millions of tons of water, falling back onto the sea, had sent out shock waves that rolled back the ocean's surface in a monstrous swell. And now the monster was moving swiftly landward. Gary could picture the terror of the doomed fishermen as they saw the green wall roar upon them. They had had no time for anything but that brief warning message. And even now there was no time for residents of the New England coastline to escape. The wave was sweeping toward them over hundreds of miles, and nothing could withstand its fury. Grimly, Gary fought down his growing panic as he watched the ocean's horizon. Jordan saw it first. He grabbed his brother's arm and held it hard. "Here it comes." The monster was heading right for them. Second by second the wave grew. Somewhere out there, deep within the ocean, a tremendous explosion had occurred. A volcanic action on the ocean's floor had sent this shock wave racing toward them, pushing the water into a towering swell that would soon break in all its fury upon the shore. And its speed perhaps 500 miles an hour. Jordan gulped with fear as the monster sped toward their flimsy perch. "Jordan! Here it is!" He heard Gary's shout above the deafening wind as his brother quickly pulled off the lens cap and pointed the camera toward the approaching giant. By now, the wave had blotted out all lesser waves and tossed them onto its rolling crest. In seconds it would be upon them. The ugly, greenish-black mountain of water swallowed the offshore reef with an eager gulp and raced for their beach. Noise and vibration blotted out everything. Jordan could feel the cliff shudder beneath his feet as the monster crested 100 yards offshore and began to send up towering spray. Gary cowered behind the rock, holding on with white fingers. The wind was far worse than any hurricane. It was so deafening that he had to squeeze his eyes shut and scream. He could hear nothing but the roaring sea now. And then the wave struck. A split second before the gigantic water wall arrived, Jordan was thrown on his back by a near-splitting rush of air. He had a glimpse of the white spray as it soared far overhead. It seemed to lift endlessly. Then it was all around him, crashing down upon his upturned face and hammering him into the ground. He tried to cover his nose, but his hands were pressed down to his sides. Jordan fought for breath, choking as seawater filled his mouth. The cliff shook crazily beneath him. Then the sky was visible once more. Jordan watched the awful wave crash along the shoreline. It was hard to believe the monstrous water wall had passed just below their ledge, and that all he had felt was the spray. Now he could see the black monster's final effort. All the fury that had traveled across half an ocean burst on the New England coast. Trees were hurled into the air or carried inland like stalks of celery. The bronco disappeared under the pounding giant, was lifted high in the froth, and then vanished as the wave crashed deep into the woods. The wind died suddenly on a last rolling echo from the distant cliffs. Then, silence. Jordan crawled to his feet, coughing. The backwash of water poured out of the woods, kicking up more spray in the sea below, but the terrible wave was gone. Jordan, alarmed for Gary, looked around. His brother was sitting behind the rock, the camera clutched against his chest. "You all right?" Jordan shouted. Gary nodded. "Except for having my face rubbed in the rock." They both sat down, ignoring the rain. Soaked to the skin, they shivered and looked down the cliff. The beach had reappeared. Vast chunks had been gouged away, and much of the sandy bottom was piled against the base of the cliff. An entire section of the rocky wall had broken loose and toppled into the sea, leaving a gaping hole about halfway up the cliff. "I still don't believe it," Gary said, shaking his head in awe. "If I live to be 100, I'll never forget it." They waited, watching the clouds gradually turn ragged in appearance. The rain slowed, then stopped. Finally, the wind died, and the sun shone weakly through the clouds. "Now we can try to climb down," Jordan said. They made their way back down the cliff, moving carefully to avoid loose rocks and mud. As they reached the gaping hole in the side of the cliff, Gary let out a gasp and sat down suddenly. "Twisted my ankle," he said. "Here, let me have a look." Jordan ran his fingers over Gary's foot and the younger boy winced. "Nothing broken," Jordan finally told him. "But we've got a long walk back to town, so take it easy, kid." Gary laced up his sneaker loosely, and slowly stood up, leaning on his brother. "A 5-mile walk. That's just dandy. But I'll be okay, I guess." They were about to start down the last 50 feet when Gary's grip tightened, and he hunched over. "What's quickly wrong now?" Jordan asked. "Look." Gary pointed into the dark opening behind them. "There's something stuck in that big rock over there." Jordan bent over to examine the curious outcrop on the cliff wall more closely. A small object gleamed dully in the rock. It appeared to have been carved or shaped in some manner. Jordan rubbed it with his hand, brushing away a coating of rock dust. The thing began to sparkle. "This is crazy," Jordan muttered. "It looks like some kind of little statue. Must have been carved from quartz." His efforts to pull it free from the hard rock were in vain. It was solidly embedded. "How do you suppose it got in here?" Gary asked. This was a solid wall of rock. "Why, it must be 10 feet in from the face of the cliff." Jordan shrugged. "Search me. All I know is that there wasn't a cave here or anything like that." He reached in his pocket, took out a large clasp knife, and started prying at the strange object. The rock split slowly under his careful chiseling. Then his knife blade accidentally slipped against the statuette and suddenly snapped.
Blast it.
Jordan looked at the broken blade and his eyes widened. Why, that thing must be so hard it would take a diamond to carve it. Using the broken blade, he finally managed to dislodge the carved stone. He turned it over and gasped at the delicate modeling with which the unknown artist had done his work. It was a figure of a man. Tall and slender, he was garbed in a tight-fitting coverall or uniform that extended from his neck to his ankles. But it was the face which fascinated Jordan. The carved eyes seemed somehow misplaced. They were much too wide apart, giving him a frog-like appearance. The mouth was a wide slit with many needle-like teeth protruding from the thin lips. Most unusual of all was the modeling of his skin, which was covered with scales. Jordan's spine tingled. What kind of being was this? For the first time he saw the writing carved along the flat base of the statuette. It was like hieroglyphics, but he felt that no ancient Egyptian had done this delicate piece of artwork. Jordan put the little figure in his pocket and turned to his brother.
"Come on, Gary, I want to show this to Dr. Shaw at the university."
They started down the cliff and made their way along the debris-covered beach and then to the road.
"Maybe we can hitch a ride," Gary said. His ankle felt somewhat better, though he walked with a slight limp. "Don't count on it," Jordan replied,